Hello and welcome. It is March 7th, 2020, and I'm here with Jim Fernandez in his Hyde Park apartment in Chicago. I'm David Sutton, and I'm going to be talking to Jim today about his career in anthropology. Jim is an emeritus professor at University of Chicago and has made quite an impact on the field in his work on metaphor and other tropes. And so I thought today we would talk a little bit about how Jim got interested in anthropology, how he got interested in tropes, and some stories about the process of becoming an anthropologist and a theoretician of a certain kind. And Jim is, even though he's been retired for quite a while, he still teaches. He's about to start teaching his course on oral narrative in 2 weeks' time, I think.
3 weeks.
3 weeks. I won't rush you. So I'll turn it over to you, Jim. And I know you wanted to talk about some of your early influences first, including Albert Schweitzer. So,
David, it's such a pleasure to be here with you in my own house. That's really great. Familiar in every sense.
Right.
You and I are familiars dating back many years. This is a familiar place to talk to you. We've talked many times before. It's always a challenge to talk about one's career or one's dedications. And I thought that I would like to begin by the experience that Renata and I had about 3/4 of our, almost the full way through our 2.5-year first experience in Africa, sort of first field trip among the Fang people of Western Equatorial Africa, people who were largely the patients that went to the Schweitzer Hospital. And we ourselves became patients of Schweitzer. We went south to an adjacent neighboring tribe to the Fang across the Ogowé River. His hospital was on the Ogowé River, and we got a little sick and a little depleted. And we had every reason to go to the hospital to be restored. We were really bush-beaten. And so we went there and were received well. We weren't so sick that we couldn't eat at the same table with Schweitzer. And because Renata is a German speaker, he put her right across from him. That's a distinct honor for the time, and right. I'm sure she was impressed by it. As we stayed there a little over a week, we got talked out, as one might say, and other people came to sit across from Schweitzer, and we were gradually moved down a long table to the very end. When you got to the end, it was time to leave. Nobody ever articulated that, but you understood that. The further away from Schweitzer, he sat at more or less at one head. He never sat at the head of the table, always at the side. Mm-hmm. So we had the Schweitzer experience. And that's important for us. He was a major figure in the world. You know, he had the Nobel Peace Prize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to have that. He was also a vegetarian, as you know, a very committed vegetarian, and a vegetarian who learned to eat tropical foods, learned to eat local foods, not into, as most French and other missionary people were, to eating local foods, but still being dependent on foods that come sent out from Europe. Not for Schweitzer, it was all local food. Mm. And I remembered Schweitzer in the connection of talking to you about my career, because Schweitzer is responsible for, I think, a very important book for anthropologists called Respect pour la vie, or he often called it reverence for life. Mm-hmm. He was a believer in, that was a time after the atom bomb. He was very much against the atom bomb as a most inhumane, a terrible weapon that's largely interested in killing people, mm-hmm. et cetera, et cetera. So his book on reverence for life was something I read carefully and thought of it in relationship to anthropology. I think that anthropology, in some sense, has a reverence for human life, and the work should work in that direction. And periodically, I've remembered Schweitzer, and I got an honorary degree in 2015 from the National University in Madrid. And in my talk, which was called When the Map Becomes Territory, related to work that had been done by a colleague of mine here at Chicago, Jonathan Z. Smith, who I'd also been a colleague with at Dartmouth, and who wrote also on map and territory, not with the same perspective that I was trying to do. When the map becomes territory and creates false realities. Mm-hmm. Realities really created by the map maker and not a part, necessarily a complete part of the territory being described. You can see that relationship there. And I remembered Schweitzer in that talk and talked about him as well and talked about the reverence for life. I could say that maybe one of the big experiences of my coming into adulthood when my 14th and 15th year of life were two experiences that were profound for me. The Holocaust itself. In the end of 44, we began to see these terrible pictures as the Soviet armies conquered and conquered the Germans controlling the concentration camps. We saw these terrible pictures of the inhumanity of man to man. Mm-hmm. And also in 1945 we had the dropping of the atom bomb, which I equate in terms of inhumanity of man's inhumanity to man. I equate the dropping of the atom bomb directly on civilian populations rather than on military objectives, as also a tremendous example of inhumanity, deeply embarrassing, not talked so much in our own society, but in some ways equivalent to the Holocaust. Not the same thing, mm-hmm. not the same thing at all, but still an inhumanity to man, and all the more reason for reverence to life that might control it. I'm sure that Schweitzer felt the same thing. He doesn't mention, as I remember, the Holocaust in the Reverence for Life. It was written pretty much before. He could have edited it for. It was written in the 20s, actually. Mm. And anyway, I felt that that theme is something that I've developed over the years in one way or another. Most recently, in the talk accompanying the awarding of an honorary degree mm-hmm. by the National University. And I wanted to make that the beginning theme, and what I've done for you is singled out from my own works various articles and so forth I've written on that topic. Right. Transcendent humanization is one way I have of talking about it, the need for transcendent humanization so that such inhumanities may become increasingly sacrilegious, avoidable. I don't know how much progress we've made on that, but so I've treated that, and I wanted to begin there as a theme for my talks on my career. Periodically, I've been guided by the remembrance of Schweitzer, respect for life, and the many instances we constantly have of the disrespect or the inhumanity of mankind to mankind. Yeah. And I've written about that. Yeah. It's a humanizing project also, I've called it that. And it has to do with things that you've been interested in, with the failure of categories like human. The dehumanization is a failure of a collapse of categories. You've written so well on that. Okay. My colleague, of course, Marshall Solins, has written on that. The testing of categories and their collapse in the face of egocentric or nation-centric interests, etc., etc. So right. It relates to that. I haven't made much attempt to relate to Marshall's work. One doesn't want to one is a colleague, one wants to respect one colleague work, but you don't want to become too involved with it because we're expected to develop our own. But I see that relationship in a way, and probably could refer to it more.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Jim, and I wanted to say that I didn't mention before that you were my chair of my dissertation and also my mentor, and as a mentor, not just intellectual, but I always remember it was on the eve of the build-up to the Gulf War, and there was my wife and I were going to a protest that was planned on 53rd Street in front of Mr. G's, and we were walking there, and as we got closer we saw there were just a handful of people there, and so we had a moment of hesitation and embarrassment. We were wondering, should we go on and join this very small group? It must have been half a dozen people or so protesting the build up to the Gulf War. And as we were trying to decide, we were close enough, we saw, and you and Renata were two of that half a dozen, yeah. And you saw us and you kind of waved us in, and we joined you, and it was a kind of a little lesson for me in being courageous in your convictions. Maybe we could go even further back in time to your first interest in tropes, which I believe you said was when you were in high school.
As you know, I was born in Chicago, David, mm-hmm. and my parents lived in the near South Side, down by the golf course. Mm-hmm. I had an apartment there. Then it was when after I was born, I was taken there. They only lived there for the next 3 or 4 months, and then they moved here to Hyde Park, not so far from where we are now on Kimbark Street, 55, 56. And so I became a Hyde Parker. And the end of my second year, in about 33, end of 33, the Depression finally did my father's business in, and he had to move to the Hyde Park YMCA down on 53rd Street, and my mother and I went out to live with her parents in a small town in western Illinois. And that trip was not, I don't suppose I realized it at the time, but that move from the city to a small town in the country and to the care of my grandmother. My mother stayed there for 4 or 5 months and then came back to find work as well. And I was left with my grandmother. So that movement, that cultural movement, that movement from generations, parental generations to grandparental generations was, I'm sure, very significant for me. Mm-hmm. I lived on with her for almost 8 years, and periodically my parents would visit me. But I had a sense of partially of dispossession of my parents, but a new possession, etc., probably made me a more anthropologically conscious person of the difference between ways to live, between small town culture, urban culture, suburban culture, etc., mm-hmm. made me more interested in anthropology. But many other trips afterwards, of course, and I would say I came back from grade school in a small town, just the first part of grade school, and then went to high school at really an important high school in the suburban Chicago, the River Forest, the Oak Park River Forest High School. And, well, I had the normal high school experience. Well, there are several experiences I think probably I should like to talk about here. But one in particular was a course I took, I think, of the fall of my junior year, which would be 46, or my fall of my senior year, which would be 47, with a teacher named Smith. Now, I've really been knocking my head to find out to remember her first name, but I don't remember her first name, so she was Miss Smith. The interesting thing in terms of my subsequent interest in metaphor and the tropes, etc., was that she was also fond of Kenneth Burke and taught some of Kenneth Burke to us. So from 1946 or 47, I was aware of the work of Kenneth Burke, which has been constant in my teaching ever since, most particularly his essay, which is collected in really his first book, which is called The Four Master Tropes, Metaphor, Metonym, Irony, and Synecdoche. And that's been a kind of a constant with me, so that we just had a conference in Vancouver, as you know, on which we talked about the tropes a lot.
Right.
And for me, it dates back to the early work of Kenneth Burke in 41. Not an invention of mine. It's really, I was reading some of Burke when I was in junior high school, or at latest in senior high school, in my senior year, and subsequently, in various ways, been involved with it ever since. Testimony to how important a high school education can be. It's a very good high school. I was always quite loyal to it. I was mostly an athlete in high school, I must say, but I took Latin my freshman year, which is a rare thing. I was the only boy in the class. The rest were girls, and I kind of had second thoughts about Latin as a specialty, so I didn't take any more. But there's those kind of commitments, and so I had kind of a scholarly commitment, a studious commitment, even in my first year, even though I was playing fall sports as a soccer player and spring sports as a baseball player. So why anthropology? Maybe a transported child from one cultural milieu to another cultural milieu, not greatly different. This is still the American culture, but quite different, being raised by a grandmother as being raised by working parents.
Right.
And the difference between living in Chicago, even on the south side, and a very small town, pretty well self-sufficient, farm country really. So I had that change, and anthropology is about cultural difference, so I had that kind of in me and very profoundly. And that gives you, I think, a sense of why anthropology. It is true that in college, when one begins to decide what one will do in respect to a career, I was mostly headed, as far as my mother and father were concerned, who were business people, if at all lucky and a good student, to Harvard Business School. They always expected that. And but they're surprised they were in their senior year that I applied to Harvard Anthropology rather than Harvard Business School. I thought maybe I'd made a mistake in the application or whatever. So I was put on the waiting list, but I did have a pretty good record, even though I was mostly interested in sports. I had otherwise a good record. They put me on the waiting list, and finally I kind of fell off the waiting list, and I had such confidence in being admitted to Harvard that I hadn't really applied anywhere else. Fortunately, in my senior year in high school, there was two boys clubs, or debating clubs, called Burke and Lincoln. I was a member of Lincoln Club, and Lincoln Club put on just after the holiday season in January, we put on a weekend that was a Friday afternoon and Saturday conference on the United States and the world, on what our responsibilities were now being a nation that was triumphant in war, etc., etc. And in the representation of Africa, we invited Melville Herskovits, and came out and he gave a talk, and I was assigned to be his guide around the high school, take him to dinner, where there was a dinner, etc., etc. So I got to know him fairly well, and I was a pretty good guide. I was at wit's end, really, and quite disappointed when Harvard finally said, well, we filled up our class, so the waiting list is now closed. And I thought, but I'd heard of Herskovits' work, so I decided I would go to him. I was then living in Oak Park still. I was back waiting to be admitted to graduate school, so I went to see Herskovits, and he welcomed me with open arms. I remember you very well, etc., etc. So I entered with Herskovits' program in African Studies. The first field trip was a little bit over 2 years. Renata was with me with about 1 year and 3/4, almost 2 years. She joined me in the field.
Your wife.
And that was the big study of African religious movements called BT. It resulted in that. But
was that your PhD research?
No, my PhD research that was a PhD, probably a grant from the Ford Foundation. But my PhD was on a subtopic called ritual reformulation. It was just a short 180-page dissertation in order to get that off my back. Also, Herskovits was a great professor, but he also took a long time, and if he thought a PhD had a very important topic, he was very exigent in terms of publication. So I had already a child on the way, so I wrote on a theoretical topic rather than on the religious movement itself, which ended up in being a 775-page book with a 50-page index, etc., etc.
Did you have a sense at the time of Herskovits being in the midst of this debate about, as he called it, the Negro past? And
not so much at that time, but I've participated in it subsequently. I've written a couple of things, or at least participated in panels on that book. By the way, up until recently, was still in print. The Myth of the Negro Past, one of the longest. I've forgotten what press it's with, but I think it's been in print about the longest of any book except the Bible, etc., etc. Books like that.
Wow.
And yes, I've been on panels in which that's been questioned. But he did so much more, you know. He did this famous introductory text, which competed with Kroeber's introductory text called Man and His Works. Wouldn't be called that today,
No.
but it was all right at that time. It was a great introduction to anthropology. He did economic anthropology, he did folklore.
so, Jim, you say you applied to Harvard anthropology rather than Harvard Business School like your parents might have wanted. Was there anything else in college that kind of led you in that direction?
Those were those years from that I was in college, from 48 through 52, were years in which patterns of culture were still very resonant book. It's long been a resonant book. We're talking about Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture.
Right.
I remember that one of my favorite professors, Caesar Lombardi Barber, who was a student of Renaissance English. I majored actually in English and philosophy.
Nice.
In philosophy, I read pragmatists, John Dewey, particularly, and the James, William James, and I majored in 19th century. I majored really in the 19th century novel, but in English generally. I actually wrote my dissertation on Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle. I don't think I have much to say about him. It was quite a challenge. I'm not sure I did a good job, so I don't. But a very interesting early part of the Romantic period in England. Well, as I say, Patterns of Culture was still a relatively new book. It hadn't given much attention because of the war. It was important in 32, 33, in which it was written, I think. It became, well, the Depression, et cetera, et cetera. It really came in its own after the war, along with other work that did on Japanese culture, Chrysanthemum and the Sword.
Right.
She was very much a favorite author for one of my favorite teachers, Caesar Lombardi Barber, student of Renaissance literature, and also a student of James George Frazer and the influence of Fraserian culture in the early Renaissance and earlier on. So he talked very positively, personally, actually, about that would be, I'm almost, he'd say things like, I'm sorry, I'm not an anthropologist.
I see.
He would say things like that. I mean, there's so much interesting literature there. I guess he was running out on English literature. But anyway, he was part of the encouragement that I should apply for anthropology. There were other influences as well. I remember a student who was much into anthropology. Solomon, his name was, George Solomon. And he talked to me positively, and he talked positively about going to Northwestern as well. But all of us who applied for graduate school would apply because Amherst-Harvard relationship. You were expected to, if you were any kind of a student at all, you'd go on to Harvard if you could.
I see.
Maybe I might have gotten into Harvard Business School, and we wouldn't be here today.
All right.
So I think that And I read Ruth Benedict's work and was quite interested. I read The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, and I read Patterns of Culture. So I wasn't completely ignorant about it, but I didn't think at all of going on in African studies. I thought of going on to Harvard in anthropology, and they would guide me. And as it turned out, I feel very satisfied with a lot of money. That was the first big and important African program at Northwestern. We had Africans regularly coming across. It was part of America's feeling of their large world responsibilities. We should have a strong African program, well funded. So he got a lot of good funding from the government. It was well funded, and he was an important Africanist as well. A very productive man who worked. He worked 5 fields almost, and he actually did some work in physical. One of his early papers under Boaz was on the measurement of African American heads, and the change from Africa to the United States. And he was very much a Boazian. I've always considered myself a Boazian. In Herskovitzian, Boazian, etc. That probably wouldn't have been my experience at Harvard,
right,
or even at Chicago at the time, because they had powerful we know who I would have studied under here. I subsequently did field work in Western Equatorial Africa, among the Fang, Guinea, Cameroon, and Spanish Guinea, Guinea Española as it's called. From 78 through 1960.
To 58. From 58?
58, I said 78. 58 through 1960, and then I did in 1966, I worked in South Africa among the Zulu for 8 months. In 1965 and 1966, I worked in West Africa in Togo, Dahomey, and did a very brief ethnography there. It's not widely known, but I have an ethnography on a religious movement in southern Ghana at that time. So, and I also worked a bit in East Africa looking for a religious, I was specializing on religious movements, and that was a source of funding. I was relatively lucky in getting funding for those studies.
And how did you start to develop the interest in what you call the figurations of social thought?
The figuration of social, well, it begins really with Miss Smith. Let's call her Carrie Smith. That's a name out of a famous American novel. Anyway, and her interest in Kenneth Burke.
Right.
And I kept up that interest in graduate school. I wrote that doggerel that Herskovitz took off wasn't it a thought Titanic to think of culture as organic? It's a long poem, relatively long bit of doggerel I wrote. I used to publish poetry on the bulletin board of the department. He sent it into Soltax, and Soltax published it in 1954 American Anthropologist.
Oh, wow.
My first claim on, but he published anonymously, so I always refer to it as anon. It's the first thing I refer to in my bibliography, is anon, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so I had a Burkean interest in the figuration
Right.
of social thought.
But not many other anthropologists were citing Kenneth Burke, I imagine.
I don't think so.
Well, of course, except, I mean, I have to mention that he produced one of the most famous Marxist feminist anthropologists of the 20th century. Eleanor Leacock was his daughter.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
I marched with her, as I wrote you, I marched with her in an anti-nuclear bomb parade, and with your mother, I think.
Wow.
While I was at Princeton. I remember
Right.
coming back from it.
Right.
So Eleanor Leacock, I think with Connie was along as well. They were good friends.
They were best friends.
Yeah, so I'm sure I did have that privilege.
Yeah.
That would have been in the 70s, late 70s sometime.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, Paul Friedrich and Terry Turner both were interested in polytropy. I think Terry's, but Paul did in that collection we did on metaphor. Polytropy is certainly the outstanding piece in there. I mean, that's a continuity that explains things a lot, for sure. I think that
so the figurations idea comes from Burke, and then were you developing it at the same time as symbolic anthropology?
That's an interesting question, because I should comment on length on that, because there was a tension between the development of the tropes and symbol studies, and the kind of just to use the master word, the master article was the one I published in Current Anthropology on the mission of metaphor, in which states my predicated paradigm. The interesting thing, that's a good question, because there was a notion of symbolic anthropology, and there was not the notion of topological anthropology. We developed that later on the basis of Paul's polytropy, of Terry's interest in the same. Terry was always interested in the metaphors, and never really published on it, except in response to my invitation. So whenever I invited him for this collection that we hope that they will publish at what's the name of the
Berghan.
Yeah, Berghan will publish as part of their collection on rhetoric culture that Tyler and Strecker have done. He has an article. I invited him to contribute to that, and it's on the tropes and polytropy.
You're talking about Terence Turner, yeah.
What?
You're talking about Terence Turner.
Terry Turner.
Yeah.
Sorry, we seem to be so collegial here. Who are we speaking to?
Yeah.
Each other.
Right.
Yeah, good. So, and then Terry did one for that, and for Beyond Metaphor. He has a good piece, mostly on the issue of the tropes, actually, there. I didn't ask him to do that specifically. So he never did much for himself, but when Fernandez invited him, Fernandez is not dealing adequately with the tropes, and I'll set him straight. I always felt this is a set you straight article, and good, interesting articles. Yeah, I use the notion of domain, that interdomainal predication is what metaphor and the tropes are all about. And there's also the notion of frames. And Terry doesn't like the notion of domains, and frames has been around a long time, since Goffman, et cetera, et cetera. It's been a big intellectual tradition, so he argues a bit with that.
I see.
Instead of interdomainal predication, he preferred interframe predication. I should really sit down and set him straight. But now that Terry is gone, I don't feel I should do that. I should just credit him for some very interesting pieces on that.
I know you wanted to say a little bit about the Victor Turner aspect.
Well, Vic, when I was at Dartmouth, Vic and I had a very positive relationship. I was interested in different things in his work. I taught it. I was at Dartmouth. Was I chair? Not yet, I think. And in 1967 or 68, I had a conference on ritual, particularly for Vic to be the centerpiece. And this was before the publication of the ritual process. A year before, he had the manuscript and he read from it there. Terry was invited to it. Nancy Munn was there. Well, those are the people that kept relationships with. And Vic came and gave the principal paper. And a colleague of mine, did you know J.C. Smith at all here?
No.
In the religion department. He was at Dartmouth at the time. He participated. He went on to become an important professor of religion in the department here, you know.
Right.
And he was dean for a number of years, and he wrote on the issue of map and territory too. So that's why I mentioned him in my PhD address. And so it was a wonderful conference, and but somehow Penner and I, Hans and I, couldn't get it. It was a friend. We could never find a way to get it all together, and I don't remember why. But it would have been a very good publication. Well, you see Terry and Nancy and Vic and etc. And we never did get it together. It's a failure that I've never quite explained to myself. Hans was a student of Eliade's. And so Vic and I were good friends for that. While he was at Cornell all this time, he did a number of books there. And then I began to move on metaphor. And on the tropes. We call it tropes now because metaphor passed into tropology in the 80s. You know, we had the various things on it.
Right.
And in about the same time, I was working or had sent it off for publication, a mission of metaphor. We had a debate in science, a 2-page debate in science on what was more fundamental, the metaphoric process or the symbolic process. I argued for metaphor, and he argued back about symbol. So it's laid out in science. Well, he had published something on ritual there, and I took him mildly to task for neglecting the importance of figuration and the predicative process, etc., making a case for an argument that shortly was to come out in current anthropology. And he responded to it. So that was kind of the breakaway of trope theory from symbol theory. And that would be an important reading for anyone who is trying to decide what happened to symbolic anthropology, what is the relationship of tropology to symbolic anthropology, etc., etc. That would be something one would want to refer to. And then I went on to publish various other things on the symbol and in relation to metaphor. In that list I've given to you there, you find those there. And I'm hoping to pull together something on that myself. I've been thinking about that issue. Symbolic anthropology was very big for a time, and I don't think that tropology or tropological anthropology has ever gotten quite that important. I think the overall category is for many people's thinking is symbolic anthropology. So the subcategory is tropology as a subcategory. I don't see it that way. I see it, the synesthesia that is present in the tropes, the interdomainal predication is kind of basic and fundamental. Currently, I've been thinking of that in relationship to I don't know if you've followed this at all, the psychological, paleo-psychologists and paleo-anthropologists, mostly British school people, not of the anthropology schools, but of the psychology schools in Britain. Robin Dunbar is the name that may echo with you. Have been doing work on how it is that we became human. That is, how is it we passed from caressing each other or grooming each other to gossiping with each other. The title of one of Dunbar's articles is quite interesting, which I use for my course here on storytelling, oral narrative, is from grooming to gossip.
Mm-hmm.
How is it we made that passage, which is extraordinarily important, because grooming is a direct corporeal thing, whereas gossip, you have to have ideas of others, of the other as being somebody to gossip with, and of others that you gossip about.
Right.
So you're developing an imagination of the other, who is your conversor, and of whom you're talking about. They haven't worked that out fully. I think they need anthropological help. Well, I think so, but I do teach something about the origin. Our humanity essentially is defined by our imaginative capacities,
mm-hmm.
our ability to imagine. And as Geert said somewhere, in fictio lies humanity. And these people are arguing, this man who wrote *Sapiens*.
Yes.
In chapter 2, he states it fairly succinctly. He summarizes the argument of the cognitive. What is the cognitive? Big cognitive transformation? It is in the development of an imagination.
Mm.
And then for a long time we were gossiping before we moved on to beyond gossip to storytelling. And that's a minor part of the course on oral narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the last 4 or 5 times I've taught, I teach it every year. I try to develop that a little bit. It's interesting to students. I think, an exceptional shift from into an imaginative world that we've made, just how we did it.
So is that where the inchoate becomes takes on?
Yes, where the inchoate finds itself talking in some way or another, moving out of inchoate into a domain of experience that we can say something about, that we can relate to something else we want to talk about. I like the notion of gossip. We first had to conceive of others as people to do more than pick fleas off
mm-hmm.
to talk about. And what are we going to talk about? The intensely social. The argument of these evolutionists is, of course, that we're essentially social creatures, and in developing our sociality is how we developed our full intelligence. It's all social based.
Mm-hmm.
So I spend some time with that.
So in thinking about the inchoate and the predicative process,
Predicated paradigm.
Yeah.
Process, fine.
One of the concepts that you offered, which I still see as very influential, and not just in anthropology, I see people in literature citing it as well, is the notion of the return to the whole. So could you just talk a little bit about how that concept took shape in your mind or in your anthropological practice?
David, I think I probably have to credit Levi-Strauss. If I'd done my homework, I think I knew you would ask this question. I would look up the chapter and verse on that. He uses it in a different sense than I do. Mm-hmm. I have a sense of the inchoate. I kind of try to summarize. I have an article summarizing the point of views I'm taking as pronominalism. The life of the pronoun, of all our pronouns, the pronouns the others, the pronoun of self, I regard in the end as ultimately undefinable, but totally undefinable, as some kind of a whole that's greater than any particular ability to define it as a fireman or a carpenter or an academic, etc. And sooner or later we realize that that whole is there that we haven't realized in the various definitions. So I was interested to learn from Karen Fogelson that Ray was very loquacious in his dying days, and he said, I think because Ray and I talked about it, I think she told me that he said, I really have a sense of being pretty close to the whole Fogelson in my work. I don't know if he had it in my sense at all, but I'm satisfied, I'm ready to go. And the way she stated it, I thought, gee, there's some sense of the whole in Ray. I don't think I've ever talked to him about it. I don't know what it is. But anyway, pronominalism is a kind of play on words. You have both pronouns there and you have nominalism, which I think is what the anthropological task is, to be close to the actual words and names, etc., rather than any other kind of overarching view of things, or nominalists. Plus, we're interested in the pronouns. The pronouns, the predicated process is to give some identity to the pronouns, but they're always greater.
You're saying that with pronouns, we are always kind of reaching for
a definition of self that never completely come to terms with the whole that we are, the bundle of experiences that make us up. And then we find an inadequacy in any given definition. This is putting it pretty simply. This is part of the predicated paradigm, that then we return to the whole in search of some other deeper that will capture our imagination more than the predications or series of predications we're working under. That's one way of stating it. You asked me about Ralph, about Tyler's work on.
Postmodern. Your kind of ambivalent relationship with postmodernism.
Well, I have, but I will find that the notion of capturing the imagination, postmodernism, is what I don't know if I use that phrase. I use this a lot in my storytelling course, and I tell the students, I want you to tell stories that will capture our imagination. And I think that postmodernism was giving up on anchorage in meta-theories of any kind, recognizing we're constantly in definitional mode, seeking to capture the imagination. That is absolutely fundamental. That's what that's poetics to me. Right. Poetics is a study of the capturing the imagination, or failure to do it.
What about, can you just say a little bit something about the role of ritual in capturing the imagination, or the return to the whole?
Well, ritual is a predication on the inchoate, making it very experientiable.
That's right.
And so it's a way. Rituals eventually fail to capture the imagination. How many Catholics in recent decades found their imaginations no longer captured by the Eucharist, etc., etc.? I mean, it happens, and we find new ways, some agreeable, some not, to predicate upon the inchoate and find new ways to capture the imagination. That's a simple answer, but I think that's true. You see it. The rituals run their time, and for a set of reasons. But Marshall's speaking of the same thing. Rituals are a set of categories, establishing categories.
Right.
You have to take up a role, a category. Rituals full of categories that are interacting, and circumstances suddenly they become whatever as he's written so much about.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about revitalization rituals in Bhuti, so.
Oh yeah, and the old ancestor rituals no longer complete. But if you combine them, you juice them up with Christianity and some other things, you can capture the imagination. And well, my imagination is captured professionally because I have to get all this down. Right. But let me speak to that. I felt after working with Fong, I went out there to study a Sudanic savanna people coming into the equatorial rainforest. What are the cultural consequences of that, social consequences of that, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden, I was made aware of a new Bhuti, a new ritual, and I attended it, and I thought, geez, this is very, this is tremendously creative, and this is really, well, I didn't say it in those terms then. Imagine they're capturing lots of imaginations. A lot of people running into it and really enjoying themselves, felt satisfied. I said, I've got to capture this, and that's why it took so long with BT. Why I didn't write a short. Let me contrast the ethnography I wrote about a religious movement in the Uvenos movement in southern Ghana. I didn't feel, well, I felt it was pretty bureaucratic, or even we'd say corporate today. And I wasn't so much, I was interested in him, but not in how the cult itself. So I finished it off in 80 pages, but somehow I felt this is needful of a lot of my time if I'm going to get this down. So how long did I take? I mean, I did the ethnography of the Woveno movement in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. I just got it out. They were asking for have you had any results? I mean, they were so corporate that they had a whole group of people writing me saying, we're expecting to hear from you, and you've been among us now. We'd like to know how your experience was. So I wrote up a short ethnography. I ought to send that to you. I didn't hear from them. They didn't like it, I think. It wasn't long. Whereas with BT, I've been hoping that they would translate that into French so it would be available. They've never been translated. And that's upsetting to me. I've mentioned it, and I no longer work in France, so I don't have any context there. But in 1999, New York University had a symposium on the drug taken in BT, which is called Eboka, Tabernanthes Eboka. And the medical school was very much involved with it, and they asked, so Renat and I wrote something on following the path in BT. Nice little short thing. So I went to it, and lo and behold, the government of Gabon had sent a representative to be at the conference, and he asked me during the conference to come to the podium, and he presented to me, speaking in French, he presented a flambeau, a okume torch, and you light it. I have it out in Estes Park, and by the fireplace there. And you light it, and okume has a pitch that burns very well. And he gave this to me. He didn't light it because in appropriate circumstances, because you provided so much light to our understanding of our religion.
Oh, wow.
He was a member of BT. It was a very moving moment for me, but he's never read. He's seen the pictures. He hadn't read it, though.
I see.
I'm sure he hadn't read it. I'm sure they just saw it and they heard good things about it, but I'm sure he didn't. So that's been a disappointment to me. And
can I ask, did you take Eboga while you were there?
I did, but I got sick. No, I didn't really get into it.
I see.
I took it and got sick. Right. Just vomited.
Yeah.
Probably an impurity or something.
Right.
So I can't claim to have had the experience.
Right. So you published BT, I think, in 1982, and then you kind of had this shift of your research from Africa to Europe, specifically to Spain. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. In 1955, Herskovich, who I had a very good relationship with, I really loved Mel. You're not a really loved guy in the discipline. There are a lot of critical things said about him that paid me, frankly. I've written about him defensively in several places. He and I had a good relationship. I think started in high school. I conducted him around. And he said to me, I was planning, he said, by the way, I have some money from Carnegie. And I could, we know very little about the Spanish possessions in Africa. Would you take some of that money and go to Spain and look in the archives about Guinea Española and Fernando Po and Principe and the other Spanish possessions on the Gulf? She gave me the money, and I got some money from my grandmother, and I went and spent 8-9 months there, and I had a hell of a good time. Listen, I didn't speak Spanish. My father thought himself was an Irishman. He was raised with his mother, who was Irish, My grandfather died when my father was 7 years old. He was raised by his Irish mother, so in the Irish community. That's why she had a relationship. So he thought of himself as Irish. And so I wasn't raised in that, but they just welcomed me as what they call Indiano, somebody who has been out the Indies and returned. So I had a wonderful, my daughter's over there right now enjoying it.
Oh, great.
And she write me, they take me as the daughter of an Indiano. She speaks good. She's the only one who really speaks good. Well, Renata speaks it pretty well, but Lisa speaks excellent Spanish. She's very linguistic. So anyway, I had a wonderful time out there. So then in 1966, Renata and I were thinking of, Renata was uncertain about taking the kids to Africa because we get so far out in the woods. If something happens to them, you know what'll happen. And in '65, she took Luke and Lisa, and Andrew wasn't born until '69. And we had Luke in '66. We had worked on the fishing people of the shore who had a lot of religious cults that they were developing in Togo. And Luke got sick with fulminating, vomiting, diarrhea. Right. And he was only 2 years old. Wow. It was very dangerous. Yeah. Frightened the hell out of us. We saw him just kind of like a leaf on a tree, just getting drier and dried up. Geez. And so finally we borrowed a car. I guess we were without a car at that time, and borrowed a car and took him into Lomé and took him to the Peace Corps headquarters. The only people I knew, and they had medicine, and they had they fed him ice chips, and they brought him around. But it was so close, and it confirmed Renata. I'm sure it confirmed Renata the nurse was, well, bring our kids here. Yeah. So I said, well, why don't you start in northern Spain, Asturias, because I had a terrific time about 4 years ago, but I never got up to Asturias. This will be a way to go to Asturias, and I'll continue on the Africa work, and I'll continue on. I continue on really for another 10 years, devoting myself to Africa. Mm-hmm. And then she started that's how we started in Spain. I see. And then I've since. So it was for her dissertation on salt? On salt was that, and well, you worked with her on that, you know, and she continues, I think, I continue to be Jaime de Renata, the husband who's joined us. She's been the researcher there. Well, we have a lot of interesting materials. It's holding me back somewhat, but we'll get it out in the next year or two. Mm-hmm. It's really complete. It has to be enriched with the things that I like to include is revelatory incidents, you know, at the beginning of every chapter, as we have in Buiti, and persons of the theatrical personages, argumenti personae and dramatis personae. Mm-hmm. I start, so we work the people through. They're not just found at one point, but I work the same set of people in different circumstances as I do in Buiti. That's part of the creativity of Buiti, is you find a person here, and then he 3 or 4 chapters later he comes up again. Well, who is he? You see him in the dramatis personae. And I make a difference in there, Buiti, between dramatis personae, who are dramatizing their culture within, and this is a revitalized culture. Mm-hmm. It's not just the same as fine culture itself. You make that clear, and then in a religious movement, they are particularly interested in creating images, capturing the imagination with images. That makes them into argumenti. That's where argument of images comes from. You see they're making an argument of images that'll capture imagination for people who are feeling already suppressed, etc. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's all there in Buiti. So, and did I haven't had the experience, having only had one real field site, but many anthropologists. We've had it in over time, certainly. Richly, it's very rich, but yeah. Thanks, yeah. But in terms of the comparative perspective and having done certainly different kinds of field work, but still extensive field work in 2 very different places, do you think that that's changed your larger perspective? I tried to be go native in the sense that we lived depended upon the African communities in which we lived, tried to avoid any real relationship with the colonial presence, tried to be as much Fang as we could possibly be. It was this wonderful experience of going once down, and I had a Dodge Power Wagon that I used. Driving down there, I usually took people to town in the back of it, brought them back, used it for rapport. And I went to the chef de cercle, and he wasn't there. And they were closed because he was holding a party at his house. And I had the unfortunate ambition, well, I'll go see him there. All he needs to do is to sign this paper. So I went to his house, set back in a fairly large house, walked up the steps, and I saw that they were enjoying themselves. All the French administrators and the chef de cercle was enjoying himself, and so I knocked on the door. And he looked, and I saw him looking imperiously. He was a short man, actually, shorter than I was, Napoleonic, I'd say. And I saw him marching down. Oh, I thought to myself, oh. He marched down militarily to me. He says, "Qu'est-ce que vous voulez? Qu'est-ce que vous voulez?" I said, "Monsieur, ce sera possible à fermer? You get off this porch immediately, and you come to my office hours," he said in French. The back of the truck was loaded with Fang, and they observed that. I was deeply embarrassed, but it turned out to be it was widely spread throughout the Fang. Did you hear how the chef de cercle? They were trying to become independent. Treated, what would they call me? In Dong, Fernando Dong. Fernando Dong was thrown off the porch of Fang. Oh boy, did my report go up.
You were one of them.
Well, came close to it. None of them would have dared to go to that porch, And they thought, well, he has a lot of, "Monsieur, vous allez quitter le porche à ce moment-là." and I can still remember how, oh God. And I went down, I suppose, and got in the truck, drove away. And the person in the cab, they were quite buoyant. They weren't discouraged at all.
Wow.
That's a story we ought to end on.
Yeah.
Because what's happened in Spain is I've become part of the academic community. They look to me to give talks. They've invited me to many interviews. They give me an honorary degree, et cetera, et cetera. But we've never really, as we did in Africa, live with the people in this kind of circumstance that I'm not part of this colonial. I've become a part of the middle class. That hasn't affected us. It certainly hasn't affected Grenada, but it's a different kind of experience. So I can't really tell you. If I had gone to Spain and lived up in the mountains in a cattle keeping community and tried to avoid, then it would have been a comparable circumstance. But the Spanish were glad to see me. I mean, they're well aware that's a problematic category in Anglo-Saxon society. And as you see that from the Hispanic radio, they're all separate from us. On Sunday morning, when you see people come to talk about, they almost never invite somebody from the Spanish community. But we've been well received. We're very happy there, but it's not the same. I could be more.
But you've still produced a lot of important work in Spain as well on conviviality, on.
I've not produced a boutique. If I ever could do that again, it took me 20, 30 years to do that.
So you think of yourself as an Africanist who also has worked in Spain.
I remember the African years. I remember this moment of Luke, of suggesting, well, maybe we should work in Spain because we can. He's gotten sick there too, but you're very close to a good medical situation.
Right.
So. It's not a comparable situation for me.
Okay. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about is the concept of consensus that appears in your work in a number of places. I think you use it to talk about symbolic consensus, but you also, I think, use it to talk about that what you call mutual tuning in, that's part of the process of human connection.
Yeah.
So it has a sensory component too.
Right.
I wonder if you would just say a little bit about that.
Well, you know, in 1965, in American Anthropologist, you know my symbolic consensus article, which I make a difference between cultural consensus, agreement intellectually on the meaning of the things we do,
Right.
and social consensus is an acceptance a principio, an agreement that you a predisposing, which is essential in a way. We meet somebody that's predisposing, so that we have social consensus almost to begin with, or they say something or something happens that we agree to interact with them in a significant way, as opposed to cultural consensus, agreement about what they may be saying or the way they may be acting, but not necessarily implying social relationship.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the consensus, I first used the consensus notion, but I guess it comes down to the ability to capture the imagination. There's a lot of consensus that goes into that at various levels. Your imagination won't be captured by somebody who doesn't have probably some predisposing aspects to himself that you can see yourself in a long-term relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much, Jim. This has been a real pleasure.
We can't knuckle bump.
Yeah. And
it's been a pleasure also for me, David. I couldn't be a greater pleasure than to sit down and talk with you. Actually, really great.
I feel the same.